All right, today we're going to learn how to fix a couple of very common JavaScript errors. These are runtime errors, right? Which, as you know, runtime errors happen during the execution of your JavaScript and they crash your program. And so these are very common runtime errors. They say something along the lines of type error cannot read properties of undefined, or type error function name is not a function. And I deal with a lot of beginner JavaScript code, and I've seen beginners come across these errors and get very uncomfortable, right? When you see these errors in the console window, I don't know what to do. And so I like this concept, which is the concept of optional chaining as the resolution to these problems. And so, you know, here I put in the note, two of the most common and frustrating errors in JavaScript, especially to those who are new to JavaScript. And so optional chaining is a solution to these. Now, these errors exist because you're trying to call a property on an object and that object is listed as undefined. Okay, what does undefined mean? It just means that it's unrecognized. Undefined, unrecognized. It's different. It could also potentially be null. So undefined and null are similar in nature. But optional chaining is how we're going to essentially test for that and fix this runtime error from happening. Optional chaining was introduced in 2020 to help solve these errors. In a nutshell, optional chaining allows you to call object properties and methods safely. Okay, so it won't crash your JavaScript at the runtime. Instead of breaking the entire application, instead optional chaining returns undefined to any part of the chain that is null or undefined. I'll show you what that means with a code demonstration. Okay, now optional chaining syntax is simple. It's just a question mark before a dot. So we know with objects we have dot notation. And so we're going to put a question mark before the dot. And that is the syntax of optional chaining. And you might say, well, okay, but don't you know the properties that exist on your objects? Like, shouldn't you know that? And the answer is not always. A lot of times when you're pulling in data from the internet, you know, the data structure, the way the data comes in, it can be very complex. It might be, therefore, complex and hard to understand. It might be unpredictable. So you might not always know the structure of your data. You might not always know the properties and methods that exist. And so, you know, I thought of Brody over here because Brody was showing me he was pulling in data from the internet from an ESPN app, pulling in statistics from wide receivers and quarterbacks. And when he showed the data, I mean, it was complex. There were objects inside of arrays, inside of objects, inside of arrays. It was just a lot to process through. Okay, so anytime you're pulling in data from the internet, it can be pretty quickly become complex data structures. Okay, again, all these nested data structures. Okay, so here I have an object, and I didn't make it overly complicated, but just to show you, we do have, you know, a user object. Inside of that, we've got a nested profile object. Inside of profile, we've got a nested address. And then ultimately, we get to the city. We get to some actual data. So just as a mock example, I just made an object with some nested properties, some nested objects, and a couple pieces of data. And we've got this walk method, right, that just returns a string that says walking. Okay, so a pretty simple object to begin to practice this with some code. Okay, and I thought I'd just start real simply with like, well, how do you access data normally? And the answer to that is with dot notation. And you guys should be familiar with this by now. Ultimately, to get to the data, we just use dot notation. So the user object, there's a profile object nested in there. There's an address nested in there. There's a city nested in there. Okay, so open up a quick terminal here, and to run this node optional chaining JS, you say properly accessing a property using dot notation for nested objects. And it says the city of Wonderland. Okay, so that's how you access the data typically. Okay, but let me show you the problem. The problem comes if you try and access a property on an object that doesn't exist. Notice there is no user profile. User profile does not exist. That object does not exist. If you were to have an HTML page that calls on this JavaScript, here's your runtime error. You get a big gnarly error message, something like this. Now, a lot of beginners look at this gnarly error message and they start from the bottom and they try and trace it up. Ultimately, the most useful piece of information cannot read properties of undefined. If you were to go to your console window, you'd see a red error message with that in it. Okay, that's because this object, user profile, is undefined. It doesn't exist. Okay, so that's the problem as you see it, using dot notation, accessing a property on an object that's undefined. Okay, let me comment that out so it doesn't continue to give us a runtime error. Now let me show you the older syntax for how this was handled before optional chaining, right? So you see a lot of code that's written this way and it's fine. Any JavaScript that was written before 2020, this is how you would check for it. Okay, raise your hand if you wrote something like this already in this class. You would say if user object is truthy and there's a user profile object and there's a user profile address, and so these are all checking for truthy, right, to make sure that there's some truthy value there, and the user profile address dot city, then you would console log that this was good. Okay, so it's basically a big if else, and I know many of you have written this code because I've seen it, and so you might recognize something similar. You didn't have to write exactly this, but this is before optional chaining. And I said the older way to check if a property exists without optional chaining, I said it's verbose. That's a fun programming word. Verbose meaning kind of like I am. You just too many words spoken to achieve the task, right? Verbose means you wrote too much source code to achieve the task. Okay, and cumbersome, right? As a developer, it's a pain in the butt a little bit, right? And for whatever reason, I got a sad cat, right? This is the old way that makes our cats sad. And so this big if-else syntax, I can run this, and it says the old syntax to access Wonderland, okay? So because all of these were truthy, it prints this out, the old syntax without optional chaining. Okay, so that worked. It's just the old syntax. Okay, however, there is a new syntax which gives us happy cat. Okay, optional chaining is a way to check if a property exists. This code is concise. It's not verbose, it's concise, and it's clean. It's not cumbersome. So the optional, okay, so how much nicer is line 41? We use this question mark dot syntax. So if user profile name. Now, this does not exist. User profile, remember, user profile does not exist. Okay, so what happens here, instead of crashing the program, this optional, it does what's called a short circuit, and it returns undefined. Okay, so if I save this and I run it, it says, notice the benefit, no app crash. It just returns undefined. Okay, now that's better, right? Because our JavaScript is no longer crashing. It's not a runtime error. Instead, it's kind of a logic error, you could say, because I still wouldn't expect undefined to be returned to the user. Would you expect undefined to be returned to the user? I don't think so. Okay, so with a little bit more, with another tool, we can actually improve this code even a little bit more. Check out line 45. Line 45, we're saying, hey, assign this name property to first name if it's truthy. But of course, it's not truthy. It's going to be undefined. So instead, it will return name not found. It's one or the other. It's a really beautiful syntax for saying, hey, if this is a valid value, put that in first name. Otherwise, return name not found. So in combination with this or symbol, right, you can return one or the other, which is what I would expect. If I clear my screen and run this again, now we can say optional chaining, no app crash, and now it's saying name not found, right? That's what I would expect, something going back to the user instead of undefined. Cool. So again, the syntax is nice and easy when you're accessing properties on an object. Okay. Well, as I was trying to highlight the word properties of an object, you can also check to see if a method exists on an object. So optional chaining also works with methods. Okay, so the syntax for this is a little funny on a method, if you ask me. It takes a little getting used to. So remember that we do have a walk method. This walk method does exist. So this is just calling it to properly exist. There's nothing special about this. But if I wanted to check to see if my object has a run method, I put the optional chaining before the parentheses. See that right there? And so if I were to save this and run, it properly calls the walking method, and instead of crashing the program, calling a run method that doesn't exist, it returns undefined. And again, you could use an or symbol and return something else instead. But notice if I get rid of this optional chain, like if I just save that really quick and I run it, we're back to the same problem where it says user.run is not a function, right? We have that runtime error crashing the program. Okay, so you can optionally chain properties or methods, and last but not least, you can optionally chain working with arrays. Okay, so we got more happy cats, right? Optional chaining, working with arrays. Everyone, the internet loves cats, right? So you guys love cats. Or are you dog people? I have no, I'm not going to, I have no opinion. Let's take a look at how optional chaining works with arrays. I'm using cats because the internet loves cats, so we'll just go with cats. What do we have? We have an array of users. Notice that Bob does not have an address. However, Alice does have an address. If user sub 1 exists and they have an address, .city. Or city not available. So essentially we're saying, hey, does user sub 1 exist? And if they do, does that user have an address object? But basically this piece right here is how we saying, hey, we have an array of users and you can use optional chaining on arrays. But that's what you would kind of expect. I think that's the syntax you would expect. For me personally, I would not expect the syntax on the methods to be like that. I don't know what I would expect, but you know, that's not intuitive to me. The rest of it is fairly intuitive. And then line 58, of course, what is Bob's city? It'll say city not available. If you've been paying attention, that's what you should probably expect. And there you have it, city not available. And so the bottom line, it's just safer to use optional chaining. If you're ever unsure of the structure of your data, it's just a safe, simple keystroke that'll cause undefined to be returned instead of a runtime error. and it's a good thing. And you can really have a nice, short, condensed syntax, especially when you're comparing the older way, pre-2020, of doing the same thing. Cool? Wonderful.